Hi, I'm Hal Blaine. Let's play drums.
Can I just say that we begin probably this Hal Blaine look by going back to the wall of sound sessions that he played on for Phil Spector. And is there anything more exciting, guys, than Phil Spector's wall of sound? When we listen to Ronnie Spector and Darlene Love, and we listen to these great singers and these great players, it sends a shiver through you. Hal Blaine, if only for that. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yeah.
I think the point I was trying to get is when they did Be My Baby, that drum sound, and it was also on Poor Side of Town by Johnny Rivers, the drum effect was a slight accident. He didn't mean to get quite that sound or to hit the. I mean, Derek will probably tell me more about this.
Oh, yeah, well, I can jump in. Just getting into the technical, not that technical specifics. I mean, as a drummer, normally in white rock and roll, the emphasis on the bass drum is on the 1 and the 3, and the backbeat, as we call it, the snare drum, or the side drum as it used to be, was on the 2 and the 4 beat. So basically in rock and roll, you've got the snare drum beat on the 2 and the 4. And evidently, and I think this is true, is that when Hal was cutting the take, he dropped his stick apparently, and so he missed beat 2. And so that's what halved the thing. Instead of going boom, chuck, ba, boom, chuck, he missed out that second beat, so you had dung, 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 ba. So you lost a snare in the first bar, and Hal picked his stick up, and Hal reckons it was an accident, and it was one of those rock and roll accidents that became history.
God, that's a great story. Thank you for telling me, Derek. Yeah, encapsulating like that, because I knew that there was something that didn't go quite right, and that Spector, with those genius ears, has said, no, let's keep that, let's keep that. And Hal's gone, okay, whatever you want. And it went on to become the most famous drum opening in recorded music.
Another incredible thing coming from drum specifics with Hal was that what blew me away was that when he did, certainly the first really big chart #1 record that he played his big kit on, which had these octoplus drums and a lot of open-end drums and stuff, I think was on the Carpenters' Close to You. And when I had those fills that he opened up with in the song, with these little drums like a little 8-inch tom-tom instead of the regular kind of 10 or 12-inch diameter tom-toms, and he had this big octoplus kit, which I think, there's not a lot of footage, unfortunately, of Hal on YouTube, but there is footage of him playing Close to You and stuff. And I immediately ran out, and I think there was a company in maybe Victoria Street, Melbourne, called Lamberti Brothers, and they imported these little concert drums, and I think I was still in Mississippi obviously I would have been in Mississippi at the time, and I remember ordering these concert drums on the total inspiration that I got from Hal Blaine. So he was a groundbreaker in that respect too, that he introduced, I think was the first person to introduce big drum kits to the masses. But can I also say from a drummer's perspective, and there might be some out there that will disagree, but I would argue greatly that I'm a very intense listener, and a very intense listener when it comes to drumming, and I can pretty much hear little mistakes on records, especially from the 60s, even from great players, but I cannot name a mistake from a Hal Blaine record. I've listened to the quavers and the semi-quavers.
What about Be My Baby?
Well, yeah, at that point...
Perfect mistake.
Well, yeah, I mean, even one of the greatest things for me is still MacArthur Park, and that's a long, almost 8-minute song, and Hal just, I don't know if there was any intercutting or whatever, but I know that their sessions didn't have the time to do that intercutting, and we didn't have all the tracks available. Certainly, even when I started drumming, it was still 8 or 16 track, but when Hal was playing, it would have been 4 or 8, and they did quick 3-hour sessions. So often if you read all these books from Joe Osborne and whatever, they went in and it was first or second take because these guys just knew what they were doing. So
plus the record company didn't want to pay for that extra hour.
Exactly. And another point I'd like to make is that you were saying that Hal replaced the generation before him, but one thing that I think is very interesting, that I think Hal was 31 years old in 1960. And he's playing on records, certainly in the mid-60s. He did Hey Mr. Tambourine Man in 1965. He was 36 years old, and he's playing on records by guys that are a decade younger than him, and he's completely got the vibe. He's got the mojo. He can play with these kids.
It's also worth noting, Derek, and I think this is really important, that because he was slightly older, he became, in sort of a way, a bit of a father figure for some of these young players, most notably Brian Wilson.
Yep.
Remember remember when Brian decided to quit the road and said that he would stay in and he would make the records while the rest of the Beach Boys went out on the road. That was a pretty bold and brave step. It's covered in the film Love and Mercy. But of course it would lead to the fact where he would sit at home and he would create pet sounds and he would create other things, and the Beach Boys would come back from the road and come in and sing on it. But one of the reasons why Brian was able to pull that off was because he had the anchor of somebody like Hal Blaine to be there for him and to almost hold his hand in a way, to almost say to Brian, this is good, mate, keep at it, yeah, this is fine, what you're doing is good. Because there must have been a certain nervousness for this young... Brian wasn't a confident man in so many ways. He was incredibly creative, but he wasn't all that confident as a human being. So I think that Hal being a bit older was really important to enable Brian to make pet sounds and good vibrations and heroes and villains, etc. That's really important. I just make a point that really he was such a consummate drummer that it wasn't just Phil Spector wall of sound stuff. But you mentioned, of course, playing on MacArthur Park, but he also played on things like Bridge Over Troubled Water. He also played on Mrs. Robinson. He played on Up, Up and Away. He played on Frank Sinatra's Strangers in the Night. He played on Herb Alpert's version of A Taste of Honey. So he was an absolute consummate, pure session player that could do absolutely anything. And it's not just pop music. When he was finishing up with Spector, he would do I Get Around by the Beach Boys, but also do Surf City, Two Girls for Every Boy, the Jan and Dean thing. And then I think he would have played with McGuinn when he did the Byrds, Mr. Tambourine Man, and possibly given McGuinn a bit of the older man support that he gave to Brian Wilson. So there is so much that he did. By the time he got to 90, he had become a giant, a man among men, one of the most important session players of all time, and one whose sound has inculcated our lives. It's just been a background to everything we've heard growing up. You can't praise the man enough as far as I'm concerned. And again, you just look at these Boots Are Made for Walking, a marathon #1. It just goes on. I Got You, Babe by Sonny and Cher, and This Diamond Ring by Gary Lewis and the Playboys. Crisp and sharp and precise and quite perfect.
You mentioned A Taste of Honey, and I have a drummer's anecdote from that too, which I actually heard in an interview from Herb Alpert recently. And when people are familiar with the song, when the song gets to the bridge where they go through the theme, and then it gets to the Herb had no idea how he wanted to get back into the theme again or the groove of the song. And Hal just came up immediately with the idea, I'll just kick 4 beats on the bass drum. Boom, 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 ba. And he brought... And this,
you can hear it, yes. You can hear it in your own mind, can't you?
And this came from Hal on the spot, straight out of his brain. And Herb totally gives so much credit to the record's greatness to Hal Blaine. I mean, how often does that happen? Often you'll credit a guitar player with coming up with a riff, or you'll credit a bass player for coming up with a great bass lick that is the foundation of the song. But you don't often hear accolades given to the drummers for very simple things, not really technically brilliant things, but just that quarter note kick on the bass drum and then a build up of 1/8 notes on the snare. And this is just something that Hal probably came up with. There's probably a million stories like that from producers that we haven't heard that Hal just came up with time and again.
Yes, absolutely. Mate, I'm just sitting here playing it in my own mind. No, but yes, look, on so many things, all the stuff that we grew up with. But Neil Diamond, once he turned the corner into the 70s and did his live albums and things like that, I'm in The Fifth Dimension. He was on things like Henry Mancini's love theme from Romeo and Juliet. He could be relied upon. He's on Barbara Streisand's The Way We Were. I mean, these things just won Oscars and won Grammys.
They bring back memories, don't they?
John Denver's Annie's song, and Thank God I'm a Country Boy. He was on the Captain and Tennille songs, and he's on Theme from Mahogany by Diana Ross. He was just there for it all. As I'm looking at this list at the moment, I'm just marvelling in my own mind as to what a phenomenal player he was. And
No, he was a legend. Hal Blaine, I think, is going to be remembered very affectionately, not only as a monster drummer, and we will never, ever see his likes again, but he was also a great bloke as well.